Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for tuning into this session. Let it flow, let it flow, let it flow. I must say I want to start singing. And it's going to be asking the question, how far should automating workflows go? And I'd now like to introduce you to your moderator for this session, Britta, who is Chief Business Officer at Transperfect Semantix in Denmark. Hello, Britta.
Hello and good morning.
She's going to explain how the session will run and introduce the panelists. The only thing for me to do is to just remind you to send in your questions via the questions and polls tab on the right-hand side of your session screen. Britta, I'm now going to hand over to you and I'll see you at the end of the session.
Thank you very much. I hope that you, as I, have enjoyed Florian's presentation just now. And I think what we are going to talk about is very much a continuation of it. Maybe even an explanation of why this industry is so interesting. A very short introduction to me is I basically have an academic background. I started in philosophy and especially the philosophy of language, but I, as so many of us, ended up in this industry and have now been in this fascinating industry for almost 20 years. Started as an entrepreneur myself and now find myself in being part of actually the largest language and technology provider in the world. I can only echo what Florian just said, that our industry gets more and more exciting and more interesting and also bigger. Language is for me at the core of everything, and it's also at the core of AI and machine learning. So that's maybe not so surprising that we are actually the innovators here. And why is that? I think it's because language is the representation of the world. Language is the expression of our human knowledge, basically. So this is why AI wouldn't even work without language. So, and in this modern digitized world, of course, the big question is now, how can we actually scale that human knowledge? And hopefully, I would say, also for a greater good. In this panel discussion today, I would like to put a little bit of a view on the different perspectives of this very big ecosystem that we have learned that it is now become, where translation maybe is only part. I am joined by some industry expert, and they have for very different views on this ecosystem, and all of them in some way or other work in and with this intersection of human knowledge and AI. We are talking about automation and workflows, and the question is, of course, is it really is it positive or negative? What are the pros and cons of automation and workflows in our industry? And I think the answer is basically that it's all about multilingual content and data, and all of this content and data, they reside in some kind of systems, of platforms, and they, as we know, have a lot of use cases in our modern world. So how can we most efficiently communicate and content management all of this data? And there the workflow automation comes in, because we need connection, we need automated systems to let all this data flow. And obviously, and especially for people in Europe, with multilingual and 27 languages that we have in the EU, that challenge becomes exponentially complex. So the big question is, how does automation affect the data and the multilingual content? How can automation make processes even more secure, and at the same time also ensure quality? What is quality when it comes to language translation or data at all? And what opportunities are opening up here? So these are just some of the questions that that I put out there. I'm sure you have a lot more, and you are very welcome to post them so we can have them in our Q&A later on. And please let me also remind you that in this afternoon at, I think it's 5:30, there will be a breakout session that is hosted by Jochen Hummel, one of our panelists today, where there will be an opportunity to dive deeper into the topics. And with this, I'm very pleased to introduce my first panelist, Jochen Hummel. Jochen is presumably an icon in our industry. Jochen is, I would say, responsible maybe for the way of working that many translators in this world still does, because Jochen is the founder and inventor of Trados, that today is SDL and Studio. So basically, the CAD tool inventor. And now, Jochen, I know that you are advocating for a completely different view and a new frontier, and with an eye on automation and scale. So please give us your view on where this industry is going.
Well, thank you, Britta, for the nice introduction. Indeed, I mean, translation memory has been the workhorse of the industry for the last at least 25 years. And it did make the translator, of course, much more productive. And at the same time, it's also improved quality by making translations more consistent. But what it also did is it also made the process more complicated. So if you look at the overall savings, then of course the translator was more productive, but the process got more complex. And that ate up some of the savings you were enjoying in the translation steps. And therefore, the industry, with the time after realizing this, have developed translation management systems, TMS, which somewhat try to overcome these process issues. Now comes MT. And MT, of course, is around for decades already. But MT has reached a certain quality level. I'm sure you all heard this term of human parity, which is much discussed. I think this term human parity is a bit misunderstood because, of course, a machine is not as good in translating as a computer. But process-wise, the question is more as if you typically outsource a translation or give it to somebody, and what you're getting back, given the time, the budget, the briefing the linguist got, and so on, if it reaches the human parity at that level. And so the question is not so much, is it as good, but is it as good as what you typically get? And I think there we often have reached already human parity with machine translation, and that should change everything, obviously, in the workflow. But it doesn't. And that's due to the integration. If we integrate machine translation in a way, as we have done it at Trados already decades ago, that you say, if fuzzy match is below a certain threshold, then let's say below 85%, then we use machine translation, then it's just another proposal and it doesn't change much. But the MT workflow is very different. First, you should recycle content. So you still, of course, want to use previously translated content, but then basically you can MT everything. And then you have a translated document. And if it achieves certain quality criteria, if it's fit for purpose, you are done at that point without a human even touching the document. But in most cases, it's not good enough. So you need some sort of quality estimation so that you know what to look at and what not. Then it needs to be reviewed. That's where you get the human in the loop. Then you have to do a certain amount of QA. And then, as Florian mentioned before, then of course you want to retrain the machine. Whatever you added as knowledge to the system, you want that the system gets it next time right. And you want to update your linguistic assets. So this is a new workflow, and the MT workflow is way more complex than the translation memory workflow. And you would think, okay, well, then let's use these TMSs to map this workflow. But the thing is that very often the translation memory is baked into these translation management systems. It's often even the same product. So what we need to really get machine translation working is a total different workflow, a real production workflow, where the flow as such, the documents, the tools which are used, either they are automatic tools, MMP tools, or editors, the human actors, the metadata, that all this is independent of each other and can be mapped into a nice workflow. And in order to really make use of MT and get it deployed, automation is a must. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And I think that's the lack of automation and the lack of good workflows is the reason why MT hasn't changed the scene as much as it should have. So we have new tools, new UI, and Florian showed us these 10 new roles translators could have in the future, and some of them would apply to an MT workflow. Of course, you have new roles for linguists and translators. And all this, I think it's very important to understand that tech is very important. Yes, I mean, the improvement and the introduction of neural machine translation has changed a lot, but it's only a mean to achieve something. Workflow automation goes much deeper. It has a much bigger effect on the way we are working, because it redefines roles and it redefines supply chains. And by doing so, it creates new business models. And that's actually where the disruption happens, because anybody who has deep pockets enough can, of course, buy tech, develop tech, invest tech, and deploy it. But when the business model is changed, when the way we are working together is changed, when the supply chain is changed, then very many existing players find themselves in a dead end, because changing your business model is very, very hard and often impossible. So I think the topic we're talking about today is at the core of what the industry will see in the future, and automation and automating the new roles, the flows behind the supply chains will have an even bigger effect on the industry as the individual technical components as such as translation memory or machine translation.
It was very, very interesting, Jochen, and I think it showed again where the industry is going, and also what impact it has not only on translators, as we say, but maybe also on other players in our industry. And with that, let me introduce my next panelist, Alexandros Poulis. When we first spoke, Alexandros, you said you didn't even know if you were the right panelist on this when we talk too much about translation, because what you are doing, Alexandros, you are an AI expert. You have been working with data and artificial intelligence for decades, I believe. And you are today I think the inventor and the driver of Dataforce, which is a division, a product of TransPerfect. And I think you're even going to show us some of the data annotation and the automation that you are using, because also in your field, I think you would argue automation is necessary, workflow automation is necessary to even cope with the data that we're looking at. Please give us a little bit of view on what data is used for from your perspective.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Britta. That's all correct. And indeed, my interest lies in how we can leverage collectively human intelligence to create AI and machine learning systems to solve complex problems in the modern world and come up with new customer products, for example, with state-of-the-art virtual assistants or with machine translation systems that would focus on use cases that typically a professional translator wouldn't necessarily need to work on, like automatic translation of social media, massive social media entries, or automatic translation through virtual assistants, and many other use cases like automatic summarization and entity extraction, or even rewriting of text that gives people the opportunity to see different versions of the same text. Some other use cases that we're focusing on in our line of business are identification of fake news, or even fixing the fake news, rewriting them automatically using machine learning, And cases that have nothing to do with language, like, for example, computer vision applications in the area of self-driving cars, in the area of agriculture, and many other very exciting use cases that have come up over the last few years. Again, to develop all these interesting products and applications, you need massive amounts of data. And in many cases, these data need to be at least touched by people to a certain extent. And since we're talking about millions and millions of data entries, we absolutely have to find smart ways of automating our workflows and creating customizable workflows, because this line of business, this industry, is definitely hasn't been around as long as translation, is not as mature, so and it's not as standardized. So there's a lot of customization we need to do in the workflows, and all of that needs to happen inside the tools that we're developing to accommodate that effort. And at the same time, an interesting part of this business is how many work opportunities we have created, because there are millions of people worldwide contributing daily to this kind of work. I'm especially excited about people in underdeveloped countries, in developing countries, in communities where they are lacking, the basics, and they can have access to a mobile phone or some basic hardware, software, and start earning some money for themselves and their family. So huge impact, and definitely a huge need for smart workflows and workflow automation.
That is super interesting, Alex, and especially I saw on, I think it was on your LinkedIn profile, you also said that with big data comes big responsibility, and coming back to that, I think again, an outlook for us as industry professionals actually being able to contribute to something that has a greater purpose is actually quite comforting, and makes it both, as Florian said, interesting for investors, obviously, but I think it also makes us as knowledge and experts feel valuable in this ecosystem. So thank you very much for your perspectives here. Coming back to my next panelist, Kirill Solovyev. Kirill, you are the CEO and the founder of Content Grow, which is a product that I'm sure you will tell us more about. But in my perception, at least, this is also your development and your mission with this product is actually also to overcome a little bit, maybe the black and white discussion we have always had about MT versus human. And you talk about how automation, how machine learning, how workflow automation needs also to have some kind of checks, and that maybe an automated checks and quality estimations done by machines can even be better, maybe. So you, when we first spoke, I think you had a very interesting view on that it can actually induce some kind of trust into our human knowledge. Please tell us more about that.
Absolutely, and thanks for the introduction, Britta. It's a pleasure to be here. So hello, Europe, good morning, good evening to Asia, good night to Americas. This is Kirill from Content Grow. Like many of you, I've started career in my industry about 20 years ago as a translator. And I think if there's one thing that I still remember really well from those times is how difficult it was for me to get trusted by my customers, and also how hard it was for me to get feedback on my work that could help me improve what I do. So this kind of reasoning actually went many years later into building Content Grow's translation quality management platform. So basically, for translators here in the room, we stand for making sure that everyone has the ability and the exercisable right to get input on how to do their job better. And our platform tries to take a shot at solving this tricky challenge, how to reveal how good or bad the translation is in an objective way, or at least in a way that's as objective as possible. How to relay this information across organizational borders so that, you know, whoever is buying services can make an informed decision, and also an unbiased decision on whether they would like to collaborate with you or not. Whether it's a human setting and you are engaging with a translation buyer, such as the European Parliament, we make sure that you get the feedback that you deserve that helps you to better every time. Or even if you work with machine translation output, we stand for applying human intelligence and human insight into language, into figuring out how good or bad machine translation output really is. And honestly, Britta, you did mention advanced technologies such as quality estimation and automated quality checks, but what we see at Content Code to this day is that there's still no substitute for getting expert human linguist input on a translation, structuring it, making it clear, making it actionable. So this is the kind of data that can traverse organizational boundaries. And this is the kind of data that helps you get new business, that helps you do a better job at your work. And that's the kind of data that helps improve machine translation engines, believe it or not. So speaking about new career opportunities for translator, I think one common setting where we see with our customers is that they employ human linguists extensively to check the output of their machine translation engines. So if there's one skill that's maybe slightly underutilized and undertrained at the university level that we see, is that's the skill of figuring out how good or bad the translation is, structuring your feedback, organizing it, annotating the data in a way that can be consumed also by machines, just like Alex said, and basically using this kind of objective information on the quality of your translation or of your peers' translation to make hard business decisions easier, and to also make sure that when this data is gathered, this is done in a way that's fair, that takes input from the different participants of the process, and that gives everybody, but in particular the human translator in the loop, a voice in the process that can be used to hear how their work quality is being perceived. So yeah, that's very briefly what we deal with on a daily basis. And let's talk more later on about automation of workflows and where all of those kind of advanced concepts fit in. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this very interesting perspective, Kirill. So and to our last panelist, Dimitra Anastasio, you are a researcher and you are actually now working, I think, on a European project. Is that correct? And I would say for me, this is again very much an example of how language, AI, and data also will show up in completely new applications. Maybe chatbots are not that new, but I know that you're currently actually trying to look into a chatbot, a multilingual chatbot for all the European languages, by integrating the European MT system e-translation. So please let us know a little bit about your view on automation and maybe also the pros and cons of that from a research perspective.
Very good. Thank you very much, Britta. Welcome everybody to the panel. Some words about my background. So I am working, as Britta said, as a research and technology associate in Luxembourg at the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology. I am originally a translator, as many of us. I did my BA in Greece at the Department of Foreign Languages, Translation and Interpreting. But I was quickly fascinated by what technology can do for translation. So I pursued and finished a PhD on machine translation at Saarland University. It was about idiomatic expressions, which is, I would say, still a difficult topic for MT to solve. After that, I worked as a postdoc in Ireland at the Localization Research Center, where I was teaching translation technologies, among other topics. After that, I came back to Germany to work in Bremen and Oldenburg at the universities, and mainly on human-computer interaction. After that, I received a Marie Curie project about gestures in tangible user interfaces, where I researched also the gesture and speech alignment, where again here we can see that language is not only translation, but can be applied in different, let's say, domains and applications. And gesture is also one way of communicating between humans, and then humans and machines, of course. I'm currently coordinating a project funded by the Connecting Europe facility by the European Commission, called Enrich for All, which is about developing a chatbot for public administration to be deployed in Luxembourg, Denmark, and Romania. So we're 4 partners, 2 from Romania, 1 in Denmark, and at least in Luxembourg. And I will come back later a little bit on this to show how AI, let's say, adapts to chatbot application. So I believe that automating workflow is a very current and promising topic, to come back to the topic of our panel, because we all want to make the translation business and particularly project management and translation management in general more efficient. So we all have big volumes of content, we have limited resources, the target languages are getting even more, and we want, of course, everything to have it done in a tight timeline and in high quality. But we should always think about this triangle where we have speed, quality, and volume, and we have, of course, to sacrifice one against another, as Johan said before, with the human parity. So in my research project, particularly, I'm fascinated by language-centric AI. So what AI can do for language technology and how these can communicate between each other. So to take the example of chatbots, Alexandros had referred to this before as conversational agents, and I want to exactly support this. So it's not an off-the-shelf software, it's not a product, it's not a resource file that we download and we run it. So it is the software. They say the chatbots are like wines, they get better with time because we need data. So the chatbots get better with time because data needs to come from users. So it has to be real user data. So the chatbot has to be deployed firstly to the customer, get real data, and then the chatbot gets trained and more intelligent. Back to data, we have, we need clean data, we need annotated data, we need anonymized data. And these adjectives already highlight some language-related technologies, which are maybe discussed in the panel later. So, yes, as Britta said before, we want to have a multilingual bot. This is why we will integrate the API of e-translation, which is the neural machine translation system by the European Commission. Everybody can use it, having an EU login. And we decided to have MT in the background for the reason that the chatbot should reach large amounts of people, irrespective of language or geographical barrier. We want to ask questions, for example, where can I submit my tax declaration, or I want to change my name in my certificate of residence, and such questions. And Luxembourg, being very highly multilingual, is a very, let's say, timely topic. So to go back to TMS and close my introduction, I think that translation management systems should have workflow automation features, and all the question about AI and data should be, let's say, embraced by humans, by linguists, by translators, by project managers, and should not be felt as a burden on their everyday work. So it doesn't destabilize the traditional translation workflow, but it rather enhances it by making it more efficient. So, and the key point is that we first have to understand how AI is working and what it can do for humans. So yes, first understand and then feel positive, let's say, towards the new digital technology that comes into our everyday life. So back to Britta, I think, to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dimitra. That was very interesting to see what you're actually doing at the EU. And again, I guess from the perspective of actually supporting democracy and supporting everyone having the same opportunities to understand, to interact, to be part of our big Europe. I think when reflecting on our discussion so far, everybody would also see that we are quite pro technology, that all of us think that automation is actually a mean to a greater good. Just to challenge that a little bit, what from your perspectives are maybe the cons on that, or what are the boundaries? And inspired also by your quote, Alex. So what is the responsibility? From my perspective, working with AI and working with a huge amount of data that we can hardly comprehend or process as humans, where is the security part of it? I mean, even in these ages of GDPR and data protection, how can we make sure that the automation and the workflow not suddenly are running away from us and actually undermining maybe what we wanted to establish in the first place, equality and democracy? I don't know if that is a provoking question, Jochen. I know that you're also working on systems where you believe that, again, technology can actually help us secure personal data. Please give me a few words about that.
Well, yes, of course. I think your question had two pieces. One was a bit the threat or the negative side of automation, and then data protection. And I'm happy to answer the first one because, again, more tech could do it. So indeed, the workhorses of the industry, translation memory, and also to a lesser degree, but as well, machine translation, are both not GDPR compliant, because if you look into your translation memories, you will find a lot of personalized data, which you later recycle. And let's assume there is a sentence with a name who has transferred a certain amount of money to a certain account working for a bank. Of course, the name of the person, the amount has been transferred, and where to are irrelevant for the translation. Still, they are stored as such in the translation memory, and they are also presented as such to the translator further down in the supply chain. And later, the same content is used to train machine translation systems. And it's a bit harder to retrieve, but it might pop out. So all these workhorses are basically not GDPR compliant, because the core message of GDPR is that you should only store what is necessary for achieving a certain task. For translation, you don't need to store this information. So the proper way would be to anonymize the data, and very early in the process, basically when it's handed over from the content owner to the supply chain, from that point on, and work with an anonymized version. But of course, it still should be translatable. So there's a trade-off between anonymization and data protection versus translatability. Because if you suddenly would see a variable instead of a name, it becomes much harder for the human to translate it. And at the end, and that's what most attempts in this aspect are missing completely, it needs to be de-anonymized. And de-anonymization is not simply exchanging a string. Very often, take a number, for example. An English number is differently formatted than a German one. It needs to be localized. So that's actually very hard, and technology-wise, we are not really there yet, but we need to, and some investments need to be done, because the current flow is simply not, or the current tools are simply not GDPR compliant. It's amazing how nobody has put more emphasis and attention on this. Your second question about the negative sides, I mentioned this before, that automation changes much more. Technology, as I said, is a mean to achieve something, but if you do workflow automation, suddenly you're changing the ways people are working together and their roles, what they're doing. and it can be disruptive. And disruption is a hype term of the startup scene. And of course, it offers you a lot of business possibilities, but it's also a very aggressive term. Disruption means that you destroy something for something new, hopefully better. But what happens to the people who are disrupted? So therefore, of course, there's a lot of dynamite, let's say, in workflow automation. And I've seen some questions already which go in that direction. It will change the way we're currently conducting our business. And there will be winners, there will be losers. And of course, our task when you talk about democratization and our responsibility in pushing technology ahead of our responsibility is, of course, to do this in a way that the disruption is not too hard and not too harsh on the people who have a hard time following it.
Thank you very much. Alex, I would be interested in how you actually deal with these types of issues, given that I at least assume that the data you're working with are even more complex. So what are the thoughts that go into when you develop your system, how to make data secure? You were talking about that millions of people contribute to your platform. So how can we make sure that everybody is treated in that way that even the law requires from us?
So Britta, you mentioned our motto, with great data comes great responsibility, twice today. So I will elaborate a little bit on that. I'll use this opportunity to do so. For us, that motto means, first of all, data privacy and security. We often see, we process data that include personal information of users or patients, since we're working on AI applications that are relevant to detecting, for example, adverse events in clinical trials, or they may detect certain diseases or cancer, for example, on medical imaging. And we need to make sure to protect the data of the users and the patients and the consumers. To do so, we have to be compliant with certain regulatory frameworks. It could be GDPR, for example, in Europe. When we're talking about patient data in the United States, it's HIPAA compliance we need to follow. And then there are also some other measures and standards for physical and IT security, like SOC 2 and ISO 27001 that are required oftentimes by our clients who also have a great responsibility around the data of their own users. So beyond data privacy and security, responsibility for us extends also to other aspects of compliance. If we take, for example, applications in pharmacovigilance and safety, where any adverse event, like a symptom of a medicine, is reported on social media, has to be caught, and if it's caught, it needs to be reported within 48 hours. That means that the workflow needs to accommodate that. So the time between a human annotator spotting an adverse event that the AI may have missed until that is reported to the authorities is very small, and you have a number of stakeholders in between, right? Going from the annotator to the company that owns the medicine to the authorities. So the workflows need to accommodate regulatory compliance. The third aspect is accuracy. Accuracy in the data. That's a huge part of our responsibility, because, as I said, we are working in applications for self-driving cars. We're working on applications, on medical applications. So a lack of accuracy in the data will deem the AI product unusable or even dangerous for the user, for the consumer, for the patient. So it is our responsibility to make sure that the training data is of great quality, and our workflows through automated and manual quality assurance methods and metrics need to accommodate that and need to support that high accuracy in massive amounts of data processed by teams between 5 and 1,000 people, right? You need to get these 1,000 people to agree on very small details, which is a challenging task. And the final aspect is bias in the data. You mentioned social equity, making sure that AI products are used equally by everybody, and they don't favor one social group over another. So to avoid that kind of bias, we need to have very concrete rules about how we exactly label the data, or how we even shape the data sets themselves. So in many cases, we need to go out there and collect data sets. We've seen a lot of cases in the news where companies had to turn off their face recognition services, for example, because they were not performing the same way with African Americans as they perform with Caucasians or Asians. And the reason behind that was that there was not enough training data representing the different demographic groups. So it is our job, it's our responsibility to go out there and collect data to make sure that all social groups demographic groups are represented equally, or equally enough for the final model and AI product to not be biased.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating how much thought you actually need to put into both the product and the way you work. And I would say also, from my perspective, the human is also responsible for the design of the workflow. And Dimitra, I'm just guessing, but given that you're working on an EU project as well, and also to support a multilingual chatbot in the EU, we know that legislation very often is lagging behind actually the technology developments that we see. Are you also faced with those concerns and maybe also the struggles in the work you do, meaning that you could say we could do so much more, but we cannot within the frames of that legislation or the requirements?
Yes, thank you, Britta. So I would say GDPR is, yes, a huge topic. So I am sure it has created many jobs, because we see many GDPR officers, and it's amazing how careful, but how correctly careful we should be nowadays. It's the same when you lock your door when you go for holidays and you don't post it in social media where you are. It's the same when you leave your office and you lock your yourself having user data from a user study. So from a research point, when we apply for project proposals, we have I would say 2-3 days work just coping with how this data will be treated in the project. This means at least 6 or 1 year in advance, having anonymization or pseudonymization, when the data will be deleted, will age, gender, religion, all this other information will be needed or not. Back to the chatbot, very often users will put private data without even noticing, because you have, let's say, an agent, but is so friendly nowadays and is good to discuss with. So you might go into your personal life without realizing it. So I have 2 children, they go to this school, I'm living in this city. So it might not be needed by the chatbot. So this is not your question. So we have to see what technology should be there. What can we do with the user data to train the chatbot, but anonymizing this private data, so not to put the human, let's say, in front of a wall and use this data incorrectly. But this, I'm in favor of GDPR. So it changes our mind, how we're thinking. But there are technologies out there, so like the named entity recognition, which is today available in many natural language processing frameworks. And yes, we have to see the path following the GDPR. So I think is very relevant. And in all products and projects we are applying from research and academia, we always have privacy by design. So we design our concept based on privacy and security and ethics. So it's huge, let's say, work at the EU level, so to cover this data privacy and security.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Kirill, I also wanted to hear what your thoughts about this, because when looking at also your product statement, is that you're basically working with, let's say, risk prediction. So is it also that there is so much data, it's not necessary about how good is the data or the empty quality, but more where can we try to predict the risk of it? So how do you look at that?
Several things intersect here for us at ContentQuo. So our software automates those workflows that teams use to reveal the quality of translations, right? Whether these are produced by human or by machine. So we do happen to have quite a bit of unique data related to individual translators or translation organizations, but also to machine translation engines. And I think riffing off the previously mentioned remarks from other panelists, one area is particularly tricky. First of all, data on how good or bad your translation is obviously something that's very useful to translators, right? Everybody has the right to know how their work has been assessed, to get feedback, to learn from it, to get better. But at the same time, because of GDPR, we see that, teams that we work with, like the European Parliament, they have to go to great lengths to anonymize this information so as not to let any bias creep in during the assessment of translation quality. So those two things are in really stark conflict here. At one hand side, you don't want to know who the translator is, who produced the translation that you're assessing, because that might bias you somehow. But at the same time, you have to make sure that this information in form of feedback can get to the original translator across a huge amount of organizational boundaries and security layers, right? So this is actually a really hard problem to solve, but that's what we're playing with at ContentQuo. How can we both keep the anonymity of this crucial information on the quality of your translation, but at the same time, make it available to you as a translator if you would like to get access to this data and actually learn from it and get better at your job. So this is the kind of intricacies that we have to juggle around our workflow and our automation. And risk prediction comes kind of like a layer on top of this data. Once you have enough of information on how your human translators or how your machine translation engines perform, you can use that data like cumulatively to score, okay, but what is likely to happen with this particular translation workflow, with those humans in the loop, with those engines in the loop? Are they likely to produce a translation that's high quality, or is it actually something that will require additional workflow steps to rectify and to get to the same level? So all of this is based on the data that is collected during this rigorous quality assessment process that so many EU organizations are really great at. So yeah, these are the thoughts. Hard to combine, but also absolutely crucial to solve. So that's the next frontier for us at ContentQuo, helping people get access to their own data without de-anonymizing them in the wrong way, without letting the bias creep in and threaten the jobs that they can do and the jobs that they can get. Back to you, Britta.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I would like to, and invite all of you to maybe just now before the Q&A to let's go back to the big question, and the big question is quality. And also many of the attendees of this conference are interested in is there some kind of are we missing something when we have too much automation or too much technology? And I think also our discussion has shown that what is quality, actually Johan mentioned human parity, but how can we measure that? So would we need, if we don't already have it, a new definition of quality? Of course, in our industry, as we also call it, it is a business, And Dimitra, you said you always need to have some trade-off one way or the other, because we have very tight timelines. We also have very tight budgets and so on. But do we actually today have a, let's say, a sensible and useful quality discussion? What is linguistic quality or data quality? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question, Britta, and it's at the core of the process. Dimitra mentioned that triangle. So speed is clear, budget is clear, but in this industry, we are running a process without having a definition for quality. So that triangle doesn't make sense if you cannot measure quality. And so far, the industry has only worked with we deliver the best. That's what all are saying. But for a key concept is, of course, fit for purpose, because if you ask linguists about whether this is a good translation or not, or the person who is actually paying for the translation and needing the translation, so the business owner, you will get very different opinions. And in the end, of course, the opinion of the person who is doing something with the translation and paying for it is the one which should count. So we have to measure quality, and it's amazing how we have worked the recent decades without doing that. So quality estimation is key. It's also key, of course, for the translation workflow, because as I've mentioned before, if you have use cases where the quality needs are fairly low, it could be that you don't need a human at all. So you do your content recycling, you do your machine translation, and you are done. So the triaging of machine translation into different buckets and then focusing on the ones which are problematic are also key for an efficient workflow. And luckily, with neural machine translation, many areas of NLP, not only machine translation, but many other areas, have seen a true boost. And the same is true also for quality estimation. So we have made progress to measure quality automatically. The bigger part of the task is now from the content owners to define what they really mean, and also to define their bandwidths of tolerance. But once we have this, we will see totally different workflows, and we will see the full benefits of the tools. And only then we can work in that triangle of quality, time, and budget.
Interesting.
Can I just chime in here real quick? Johan, the most advanced organizations have already figured this out. This is a reality for teams like the Parliament and the Commission who just do this on a routine basis. So they figure out how good or bad their translations are, they gather data, and then they use this data for decision-making purposes. Question is how we do a better job at this, and how do we define what's reliable enough to be found out in an automated way, like quality estimation, which you mentioned, but what actually requires human input and human decision making. So that's the human way of quality assessment that we specialize in at ContentQuell. And both have to work together absolutely at all times, because there's no other way to cope with the large and ever-increasing volumes of content. But yeah, I think the top end of the industry has got this problem, if not fully solved, then at least has a blueprint for how to do this. And the challenge is more like, okay, how do we make the same techniques and process available and easy to be used for the people in the middle of the market and in the low end of the market?
It's interesting you're saying, Kirill, that this problem is so. I'm still thinking I'm missing the definition of quality. Alex, when you look at your line of business, what is data quality? You said you need high data quality. What is that? Is that again the absence of risk? Is it the absence of doing something wrong? I mean, you're working with life sciences and so on. So what is quality? Isn't that as Jochen said, wouldn't we need to have some kind of fit for purpose definition in everything we do?
Absolutely. A Volvo truck is a high quality vehicle, and a Rolls Royce is a high quality vehicle too, but you use them very differently. And in our case, there are projects where you need 100% accuracy and you cannot compromise it. And that could be, for example, if you're working on a test data set for a medical application, right? Or a test data set in general, I should say. And there are other cases where the the quality requirements as we measure it can be a little bit lower. Now, we have different ways of measuring the quality, different metrics. You can look at the end product, for example, and how it evolves, and the end product could be a machine learning model. And you can see how its performance evolves over time as it's using your annotated data. But to be more proactive in the quality process, you can introduce some quality mechanisms in the production process itself, so that we can catch any issues as early as possible, because as always, we have to cope with scale here. And again, the fundamental challenge in our case is, how do you deal with quality when you have 1,000 people working on the same task, or even with 5 people that are working on a highly subjective task like analyzing medical data. And there is no one single answer here about how you measure and how you solve the quality problem. It's mostly a combination of things that starts with the selection of the right people to work on the project, continue with the specific workflow you will define, with the automated quality processes that you will introduce, and all the way to communication, actually, about what the end product should look like.
Excellent. Dimitra, last word from you on how do you define quality? When do you know that your chatbot is successful?
Yes. Well, I had in mind first the translation, so let me go back on this. When I started as a freelance translator back, let's say 15 years ago, when I heard nothing back from the customer, this was great. So when you hear back, you always listen, these are the comments, this is missing, you should use this tool, or you should not use this tool in my case. So it's always, sometimes silence is a good sign for quality. But yes, it depends on, let's say, the customer and the vendor. So the quality has to be defined by every person or LSP individually based on the requirements, based on the standards that everybody sets for their process. And this is why these workflows should be, let's say, adaptive. So they should be streamlined so that they can eliminate, let's say, unnecessary manual work. And they should be reliable. So for the translation, for example, the amount of reviewers who proofread even empty output, or just proofread human translations, can be increased. So if you want to increase the quality, you send it to 2 or 3 reviewers. You pre-translate based on glossaries or translation memories, already translated content, to keep consistency. So it should be, the standards should be set before by every vendor, and also communicated with the customer. And for workflow tools, for example, the integration with other design tools or code repositories or any other tools is a plus, because it has to be adaptable. So for what works for each vendor.
Excellent, thank you very much. So now we actually, we only have not so much time left. So we're going into the Q&A from the audience, and we already have, you can see it on the Slido slides here, one of the top questions with 32 to vote, again, goes very much back to what we have been discussing. So maybe what are the new roles in this industry, and maybe also back to Jochen, what you said, will we see completely new business models? So what changes do you expect in the dynamics between translators, agency, and end clients in terms of fees, workflows, timelines, quality assurance? Florian mentioned that we would go away in some way or other from the business model of per word that Jochen, you are responsible for. So do you see that, or is it actually then again, I think, as you said, baked into the tools, that's actually quite difficult to change those dynamics.
Yeah, I think you're touching on the right issue. The biggest change will be that we are kind of done with doing words, because doing words will be done by machines. But there's a lot of expert knowledge required and a lot of tuning and a lot of human in the loop to enable the workflows and the machines to do the words. And so the currency, the whole industry is living on the per word currency, will have to be replaced into something per time, which I think is fairer and more suitable. If I compare this with another knowledge industry like computer programming, no, not a single coder is paid by line, but of course by task. And the same is true for the work we're doing here. So actually it's good news, but this will require, of course, a totally different way of working together, because if you work on a per time basis, it requires much more mutual trust between employer-employee, or in this case, very often between contractor and contractee. So in today's workflows, many companies don't really care how the work is done in the end, because actually what they're doing is they're trading with words and they're throwing the job over the wall and then it's done somehow. But how? Well, they don't care as long as they get it back for 40% or 50% off from what they charge than their customers. So that will change, and that will have profound effects and on the industry, and that will be disruptive because it will change business models, because the expert work, the different roles Florian mentioned this morning, these are all roles which are of course paid on a per time basis. And so the multilingual knowledge worker, the linguistic asset curator, the network, the workflow designer, all these things of course will be done on a per time basis, which I think is good news. I think it's great news that this doing words will be soon history, because it's tough and it's also not really scalable. And if you're a knowledge worker and you put your knowledge into a machine and then let the machine the repetitive task, you have a totally different leverage. And if capitalism works, then of course that should be paid higher because it has a much bigger value. And therefore, I think this is good news, and it will have a profound effect on the industry.
So I think this is very interesting, because from a little bit from my experience in this industry for decades now, in some way or other, I think maybe we are responsible ourselves, that we turned ourselves into some kind of commodity in some way or other, that we haven't been able to actually position ourselves as knowledge workers and as experts in, and now what we have discussed today, AI technology, gives us actually an opportunity to position ourselves in a completely new way. But do we as a community, as an industry community, do you believe that we actually have the means? Do we have our own act together to do that? So what are your views on that? Please, floor is open if you have an opinion about it.
Can I chime in here for a second? I think for now the answer is no, but maybe we can get there with the right mixture of, technology, like you said, but also mindset change. One thing that I think is really hard about translation, in contrast to many other services that Johan has compared us with, is just figuring out if the job was done well or not. Because if you don't speak the language, it's completely opaque, right? You don't have a way to assess whether it's done well or not done well. So if we could transition to, bringing data to the table that confirms that we as linguists or as translation companies are really doing a great job, and we have the data to prove it, how would that impact the rates, like the hourly rates that Johan was just talking about? How far they are able to go up if you can bring in data that shows that you, as a medical translator, for example, have never ever made a critical mistranslation mistake in your life? How would that impact your hourly rates if you are that reliable and that flawless? So this is the kind of thing that I'm thinking about here. Johan, any thoughts?
Yeah, there's another aspect. I mean, we have here Alex and Dimitra on the panel, and they're talking about other use cases. Yeah. So the thing is, in AI, I'm always saying half of the data is numerical, produced by sensors, the IoT, whatever. And the other half is textual. And the numerical part, we're very good at, kind of done. The textual part is still very, very hard. And let's face it, in most companies, translation is a cost. And it costs a couple million, and it's nothing a C-level will look at, because all you could do is, let's assume a company pays 5 million, can bring it down to 0, still they wouldn't talk to you. But the linguistic data, which Alex is using and Dimitra are using to deploy chatbots and self-driving cars and all these other things, this data sits and is understood and is created and curated in translation departments. So the whole AI based on textual data, which is almost always multilingual, that sits in content translation and content creation. And suddenly we find ourselves not being an add-on, some costs because you have to do it, but suddenly we're at the core of the most important initiatives companies will have for the next decade, building AI applications and automating their business. And that's a total turn. And every linguist who understands this and who understands the value and the knowledge they're contributing, which is currently dormant in translation memory or even more dormant in terminology database, if we manage to turn this into linguistic assets, which drives AI applications in institutions, in companies, well, suddenly we're at the forefront of helping companies not to cut a few millions in cost, but to increase the revenue.
Yeah, and I think this maybe goes back to the next question we have on the screen here, where it says that, do you agree that certain industries such as pharma, tech, life science only will need MTP specialists rather than translators in the future? I read it, maybe I'm mistaken, but I read it a little bit again, like, will the translator, will the linguist be obsolete in those? But I guess that on the contrary, as we said, that they will just maybe do other tasks, and in the life sciences, for example, or all regulated industries, we might have a language that is so standardized that we can actually use more and more machines to that. But that doesn't mean that the data that goes into that is not heavily curated and validated by humans. Any thoughts on that? That for the regulated industry, are we going faster in terms of automation and MT in those industries from your perspective? Dimitra?
Yes, I can say some words. So in my opinion, language technology, because we are speaking about this, it creates new language hierarchies. So we do not speak about translators anymore only. We should start about content authoring. So there are content managers, there are terminologists, there are project or product managers. There are also translation teachers, there are sociolinguists. So there are many people involved in let's say, in language industry. So the machine translation is just one aspect. It is a tool. It doesn't replace all this, let's say, ecosystem. So I do not believe that the translators are being degraded in their work, but rather focused on more complicated tasks. So what Alex said before, so they are being, let's say, relieved by repetitive, manual, tidy work, and focus on more complicated tasks that the machine cannot do. And there are many things that the machines cannot do. So to take the example for chatbots, because you asked me before, let's say a good chatbot would be that it gives the appropriate answer to the user. And then the public servant who is at the public administration can focus on let's say, having human-to-human appointment conversations, signing documents, which a machine still cannot do. So we take the work from that can be really easily done by machines and leave humans to focus on more complicated tasks.
Thank you very much. The next question, I think actually, Jochen, that goes directly to you. It says, what do you understand by what you get normally. I think this was something that you mentioned in your introduction. Which quality is normal?
Yeah, I mean, we touched already on quality, and of course, I threw this out like normal. So what is normal? And of course, that's the core question. So what do you normally get and how do you define it? And I admit that this is a bit anecdotal, but I know many companies who are saying, who want to get something translated, who are rather, and they know that it's very hard to expect a good quality translation from an LSP, because they simply don't know have the information, and it's too hard to brief them. So they know that they have to rework or work on it anyhow. And often they rather prefer to work off a machine translation created draft than a humanly created draft. And that's an interesting observation, because of course the machine translation has many errors, but it tends to be consistent, also consistent in its errors. And it tends to get certain things right. And that's the thing with the normal. So if you define the quality by quality criteria, which are for the content owner and refer to fit for purpose, often the picture is very different. And then if you then have a means of measuring it, then many people are saying, for that kind of content or for that language pair using that engine, I'm already there, that I kind of working off from this. I rather use the machine translation. And that's the point, I think, where the term human parity is correct. Everybody understands human parity as being as good as a human translation. No, and it will still take a lot of time till we get there. But that's actually what human parity means in the process. So what would you like to work on? And if you then get the same. And normal, of course, has also the other two parameters, the time and the money. So there's only a certain time available or given, and there's only a certain budget available or assigned to that task. And if you take all this together and you take the triangle, there are many companies out there who already experience that they have human parity and rather take it from there.
Yeah, now we have a it's a very detailed question, but maybe we can broaden it a little bit. It comes from Elvira, who asked, what is your opinion on project management platforms for LSPs? From a translator's point of view, it's often more work, and in some cases, it's also more work for the PMs. So we are talking about workflow automation. And I also mentioned in the beginning that everything is actually about connecting different platforms and repositories. Is that maybe the caveat of all this, that we actually do not have one big system that is smoothly and seamlessly connecting everything? How do we get there as an industry? Does it mean that we have to develop our own tools and systems? Alex, I guess there has been tremendous investments in the platform that you are doing. Will we ever get to a situation where we do not only automate now what we talked about, the actual linguistic work, but also the automation for the other people that are involved in the process, for the project manager, for the vendor manager, for the translator, linguist, or the expert themselves? How can we adopt very user-friendly and smooth systems? Do we have that ecosystem in place, you believe?
So I can't really talk about
TMSs.
translation, but I can give some examples from my own experience from the data labeling, data collection world, and how we try to take into consideration every stakeholder in the production pipeline, from the data contributor, that is in our world is like, let's say, the translator, all the way to the client and the project managers. So for us, again, because we are working with such a massive amount of people, data contributors, the user experience is very important. So we have a whole customer service or community support concept around our workforce. so the corresponding role of translators, but in our world, right? What we call the data annotators or the data contributors. So and we are trying to make sure that they have the best possible user experience when using our tools to process data, because we can't afford, let's say, them rejecting the tasks or rejecting the technologies we're providing them with to perform the tasks. So we, at all times, we are listening to their feedback. We are testing the products with the end users before we move ahead with any new release or any new workflows, trying day by day to overcome the user experience challenges and make it easier for them. I hear from translators, the feedback that we saw before, that it's getting harder for them because they have to deal with different components, technology components probably, and files and so on. So we are in our industry, in our line of business, we're trying to avoid that. It's not easy. It's definitely very complicated, but it's something that we focus on day by day. Then when it comes to other roles like project managers, for example, we're trying to relieve them from tasks like having to select which data contributors will work on a project, and the way because they can't possibly go and manually select 1,000 people or 20,000 people, right? But we are trying to use specific criteria, rules, and even machine learning models that will allow our platform to automatically select who is best for a specific task, who is best at annotating data for, let's say, cancer detection, and who is best for annotating data for stroke detection. We are trying to go to that level of detail. Or if we're talking about computer vision applications, we might even take an image, and the same image that is depicting a car and some street signs in the self-driving car environment, and we would ask a set of data contributors to label the cars, and another set of data contributors label the signs, because they're just better and faster. And we will try to make that decision automatically, and then recompose the photo with the labels that are coming in from the different contributors. So, there's a number of things that we have already in production, and a number of other things that we're trying, we are experimenting with, to make sure that we can cope with that scale, and every stakeholder in the process has the best possible experience.
Great. Yeah, we have time for one more question, I believe. Just back to the screen. So the role of a client's project owner is usually either email-based or absent. What opportunities do you see in terms of workflow in automation to include the client? I think that is a very, very good question, and relates very much also to the discussion we had about quality, because if quality is what the customer actually wants and needs, then the alignment of expectation, obviously what he believes is good quality, is key. So does any one of you have thoughts about how we can actually have, let's say, a full life cycle from the paying customers to the actual output?
Actually, what we're talking about here is building some sort of a content factory. And in the content factory, currently the industry is only focusing on a few machines in that factory, namely TM or MT, and then they try to squeeze a few play points out of this machine. But it doesn't matter so much. What matters is the factory as such, and how all the components play together. And of course, in the factory, it's important to have the supply chain, and part of the supply chain is, of course, also the customer. So it's amazing how much efficiency gains you can get by simply agreeing with a customer on a certain format, for example, and not fulfill their 1% of PDFs, but say, this is the format, and be compliant, and then the factory works, and do the handover into the factory and the delivery out of the factory automatically. Already this probably outperforms any savings NMT will do in the next 5 years. So of course you have to tie them in, and the way to do this is of course with commercial means. So if certain customers continue to ask for an attached email which needs to be done very quickly, well, it's the same if I go to a factory and say I need this metal part, this one part. It costs you 1,000 times, 10,000 times more than if I come and say I need 1 million of these pieces. How much is it per piece? Same is true for translation, and as long as you apply it like this, customers will also understand, and they will stop asking for this one piece. And if they really need it, well, they will have to be prepared 1,000 times more, 10,000 times more, because that's actually the effort.
On the alignment of quality expectations, Britta, that you've touched upon, it actually never ceases to amaze me how many teams buying translation invest huge sums of money into checking the quality of what their suppliers deliver, and how their LSPs also do the same in their quality assurance process, but they never bother to agree on the criteria that each of them uses to evaluate whether the translations are up to the expectations, below, or above. Fortunately, this is actually very easy to fix with the right technology. So aligning the quality expectations between different sides of the supplier and buyer spectrum is, I wouldn't say it's trivial, but it's doable. And with some of the best teams, we do this every day. So we help bring into alignment those expectations and approach and measurement and quality criteria on the buyer side and on the vendor side to make sure they assess the quality of translations the same way. So that's the only approach they can use to actually agree on how good or bad the results are at any sense of scale. Tricky, but doable.
Yeah, tricky indeed, and I think that this shows again how important the human is. Also, in the beginning of this value chain, yesterday by accident, I heard someone explaining the difference between quality and excellence, and he said that excellence is actually, if you imagine a customer service person who really cares. If you ask the question and you really care about the answer, then you're already off for a very good start. So thank you very much for this super interesting panel. I enjoyed our conversation very much, and we are now wrapping up to go back to Amanda in a minute. I think it's fair to say that we all see a bright future for us in both technology and in translation, in data and linguistic. We discussed the role of the human, and we also discussed the role of AI, maybe also its limits. And I'm very confident and forward-looking that we can actually scale human knowledge in a very meaningful and sustainable and also secure way. So thank you very much, and have a nice day ahead with TEF. Amanda, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed for leading such interesting discussions, Britta. Now there's going to be a well-being break for you all before the lunch break, which follows immediately afterwards. So what is this well-being break? Well, we're going to show you a video of 10-minute eye exercises to improve your eyesight. It's by the Satvik movement, which kindly let us use the video. It's, of course, very useful to people like us who are stuck in front of a screen all day, and it may even help us remove these glasses. The original version of the video is in Hindi, and the non-edited subtitles were created using free online tools for voice-to-text translation and automatic translation. The video will be followed by the lunch break. As well as getting something to eat, you can, of course, hold one-to-one meetings with the profiles that the AI matchmaking has been finding for you on the Britta platform. You can also check out the exhibition, as we've mentioned, the virtual exhibition, to explore some of the Directorate General for Translation external activities and the booths of cooperating associations. You can find the virtual exhibition on the menu on the left-hand side of your screen, right at the bottom. It's very clearly signaled. The afternoon sessions start again at 1:20, that's 13:20 Central European Time. And I look forward to seeing you then. And with that, I now close this session.